Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, it is, it'll be Friday when I publish this. But I wanted to talk about something that I had read recently, a graphic novel. I am back on that graphic novel grind. It is about what is essentially a funeral for a godlike figure. I am referring to The Wake by Neil Gaiman, with art by Michael Zulli, John J. Muth, Charles Vess, and many, many others. It's interesting that I read this, or that I even picked it out when I did, because I selected this like a couple weeks ago for my library, and I had every intention to read it as soon as I could. If you've been watching my last couple of videos, you know that my dad died recently, and so it's really weird to stumble across this. It wasn't intentional. I didn't secretly, order the death of my own father in order for it to be timely. It just happened to fall like this. Gaiman talked about a lot of the emotions that I've been feeling recently, and he touched upon, grief and how we talk about those who were complicated. And I'm really glad that I read this when I did. Neil Gaiman is a genius, and I absolutely love that I found his writing. Don't get me wrong, like a lot of his writing can be bad or unfocused or unnecessary at times, but Volume 10, unlike Volume 9, which was a little wonky, is in my opinion perfect. I do think after reflecting, I was a bit unkind in what I said about Volume 9. There are elements that Gaiman included that are really superb, but for the most part, I felt like it was he meandered too much, and it ended up hurting what he was going for. So Neil Gaiman is a really great author. I'm sure if you've been watching my videos long enough, you don't need me to explain who Neil Gaiman is. And this is an interesting time that I've read this fine story. But without further ado, let's get to The Wake. I will do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Wake takes place after the events of Volume 9. The Furies, who were targeting King Dream Morpheus because of his actions towards his son, and at the behest of Hippolyta, who was feeling enraged because she thought that Dream had killed her son. He hadn't. She gets the Furies to kill Dream. And so this is where we are at the start of Volume 10. The Endless family has all gathered: despair, delirium, desire, death, and destiny. They've all gathered and they in front of a crypt, and they sort of mold this golem type person to go into the crypt because they can't and get a shroud for a ceremony that is going to take place a little later. Gaiman then moves over back to the dreamscape. They're in the process of repairing after the Furies had pretty much destroyed most of the dream world in the previous volume. As it turns out, Daniel, who is Dream's son and also Hippolyta's son, is being chosen to be the next Dream. He has all the memories of Dream, and he's fulfilling the role of Dream of the Endless, but he acknowledges that he is not necessarily Dream himself. It's very philosophical in nature. So he is trying to navigate what that means. Meanwhile, Matthew the Raven, one of Dream's best friends and also sort of an employee of Dream, is off in a cave somewhere, feeling very sad, feeling very angry, and noting that although there is still a new Dream, it's not the same as before. He doesn't really know how to feel right now. But one of the other Dreamscape people end up convincing him to attend the memorial that's going to happen a little bit later, as Dream would want that. And so that's what we get. We get the rest of the story is pretty much a wake with all of Dream's friends who we've met through volumes 1 through 9, and maybe even some of his enemies, or some people who weren't so kind to him, especially the guy who kidnapped him in volume 1. He's actually present. So this doesn't seem to redeem him as a character, but it is an interesting spin, and seeing how someone who was, once so who treated Dream so harshly is sort of seen in a different light over here, especially since his waking nightmares are now over. All of the ones who are at the wake are sort of in a dream themselves, and they begin marching towards the memorial service that'll take place. And that's what we saw in, I think, volume 6 or volume 7, World's End, which is the volume where there were these two people who were trapped in sort of an in-between world. And when one of them looked outside, they saw people marching across the sky. And so that's what this was. That was sort of taking place in a future time, but also the present, and not really clear on how timelines work there. But I like the connection between those two volumes. Everyone begins reflecting on Dreams, including the Endless, who remark that they were different from Dream, but they still loved him, and they're sad that he's gone. You also get some of his former lovers, who note that they loved Dream, but they knew that Dream didn't love them in the same way. Eventually, he began to see them as just another body in his dreamscape, and so they kind of just grew out of love with him. But they still feel a lot of grief for him now that he is dead. Hippolyta also shows up. And she doesn't really like Dream, but she does approach New Dream, Daniel, and he notes that, he's not Daniel anymore, but he is willing to spare Hippolyta, because what she did when she approached the Furies, she did out of a love for Daniel. So he puts his mark on her, and now nobody can hurt her. Matthew shows up, and he remarks that he was a lot of things to Dream, and Dream was a lot of things to him. Like, at times he was a boss who got ignored. Other times he was a great friend who shared a few laughs. But it's important to how we remember our friends, and Matthew is actively choosing to remember Dream in a certain way as to honor him and indulge in those good memories. Also, Batman shows up, which I think is funny. Neil Gaiman is making full use of the DC connection there, and you end up with Batman and Superman and Martian Manhunter all showing up, even though they might not have that strong of a connection to Dream. There's the memorial again where everyone's talking. We don't hear what Death says, which I think is very interesting. But while everyone's focusing on Dream, the New Dream the New Dream is approached by Destruction, who, if you recall, was one of the Endless, but he has since left, and he tries to convince Dream to give it up and say that somebody else will come along and be Dream, or it'll just work itself out. But Dream asserts that that's not really who he is, showing that although there's an opportunity for something new, he's sticking to the beholden ways of the old Dream, so maybe not so much of a great change there. Eventually, all the Dreamers wake up as the funeral has ended, all of them feeling sort of a sadness for having known Dream. And then this story sort of ends with New Dream having dinner with the Endless, who are all smiling at him in the art. This is then followed up by a couple short stories, particularly Robert Gadling hearing the news that Dream was dead, because he was made immortal by Dream. And so Death comes by and says, Dream's not going to meet with you anymore. Would you like to die knowing this now? And Robert Gadling is not too keen on dying at this time, showing how there was a huge discrepancy between the two characters there. There's also a short story about a Chinese exile who sort of shares a bond with Dream. And then there's another one where Shakespeare is writing The Tempest, and he's being influenced by Dream at the same time. So a bunch of interesting short stories that are worth checking out in this collection too. In terms of analysis, there is a little bit to talk about with this story. I really enjoy it. It's much better than the previous volume because I feel like it's more focused, and Neil Gaiman is really good when he talks about these abstract concepts like dreaming and new beginnings and even grieving. And so one of the things that particularly stands out to me when I was reading this was the process of grieving. Whenever we experience a death or something tragic in our lives, we go through that process of grieving. In this case, it's death. Everyone is experiencing the death of Dream in a different way, which I think is great on Neil Gaiman's part, and how it's not just the same for everybody. For Matthew, the Raven, he's choosing to direct this anger inwards as he sees himself to blame. But he's also kind of upset that Dream, who's all powerful, didn't really try to stop this. And allow me to read you a quote from this. "I can leave you alone if that is what you wish. But how long? A day? A week? 100 years? I should have stayed with him. I should have never have left him there. He was my friend, and I left him to die. Matthew, there was nothing you could have done. I could have died. I could have died when the others died. I could have died by his side. And what good would that have done? If I died then, I wouldn't be here being miserable now. Matthew, isn't that a rather self-centered point of view?" And then he tells the person to go away. And it's interesting to see how he's directed that anger and frustration over the death inwards, sort of seeing maybe he's responsible in some way, and even going so far as to say, "I wish I was dead because I didn't do enough to protect my friend." And as the other character rightfully points out, that's a bit self-centered. To see that we're to blame for someone's death when we actually had no part to play at all. It's very mystical thinking. If I had done one other thing, maybe this person could have survived, or I could have died alongside with them, rather than feeling this intense grief that I'm feeling now. The other characters feel other types of sadness. Delirium, in particular, just feels simple sadness. Like, she misses her brother, and she doesn't know exactly what to say at the memorial. So she just starts talking about how she loved him and how they were both unusual together, but they loved one another. And I think that's really beautiful on Neil Gaiman's part to not only with Delirium but with the other Endless too, to really highlight their connections and how they'll miss each other. And that's the same for Despair as well. With Despair noting that she represented sort of a low down feeling, but Dream represented hope, and they couldn't be more opposite in that regard. I believe Desire even says, like, if Desire and Dream hadn't been like brother and sister, they would have had nothing to do with one another. And I think that's very interesting. But they were brought together by fate or chance, or in this case by being brother and sister. And so as a result, there's this they were stuck together in a lot of ways, and they formed a love out of that, particularly with Despair. And Despair even says, I'm choosing to remember my brother for who he was, and it's a choice on my part to do that remembering. So when someone dies, you can make the conscious choice to remember them and offer a tribute to them, which I think is really powerful. A lot of this is very relevant to me, as I mentioned before. As I was reading this, I felt a lot of sadness of my own, and I really want to congratulate Neil Gaiman for writing something that I could connect with and that could help me understand my own feelings and navigate my own grief that I'm feeling. I think it's phenomenal. I would still probably think it's phenomenal even if I hadn't experienced that death in my life. But we can't change what's happened to us. So I think it's more meaningful that way, I guess. And just as Despair is choosing to remember, another thing that Gaiman talks about is how we choose to remember those that passed. I think in a lot of cases there's a desire to remember someone more positively than you actually did, sort of retconning or changing, how history has actually played out whenever someone's died. Like, we don't want to remember them for the bad things, so we only remember the positive things. And I think that's a bit unhealthy, because if we only remember, the good things, that's not true to the person. In a lot of cases, if we recall the bad things, we can pass that down to someone else and say, this was who my father was, this is who Dream was, this is who my sister was. And if we showcase everything about them, then people can learn from those bad actions. And it's a much better way to honor someone than simply whitewashing all the bad things that they may have done in their life. And that's the case for Dream in this story, because Dream was loved by a lot of people. He did a lot of good things. But as through the volumes have noted, like Neil Gaiman has noted for Dream, like prior to being kidnapped, he did a lot of terrible things. He made a lot of people upset. He hurt some people. Like he got a woman imprisoned in hell because she rejected him. And so if you choose not to remember that, if you choose to examine, or if you choose to look at Dream like he was only good, that's unfair to him. I think Hippolyta understands that, because she chooses not to, apologize for her actions. She saw that Dream was going to take her child, maybe not in the way that she thought, but he was still going to do that. And so, she doesn't apologize. And I think New Dream, looks more positively upon her for that, when everyone else wants to tell him, like, oh, Dream was great and whatnot. And I also think it's interesting that a lot of Dream's lovers who are talking in this story, like, they remark that they love Dream, but they don't shy away from noting that he was selfish and cold at times. And that's very, very important to remember. Honesty is key here. There's another Matthew quote that I would like to read. I was going to say something about how he died, and about how that was what I wanted to do too, but that isn't what's in my heart, not really. He was the most important person in the world to me, and he's gone. And that kid, Daniel, well, he was a good kid, and he's gone too. But you can't kill dreams, not really. I mean, despair may be the thing that comes after hope. But there's still hope, right? When there's no hope, you might as well be dead. Well, what's in my heart? A lot of sorrow, a little regret, and the memory of the coolest, strangest, most infuriating boss I ever had. That's what. So Matthew's talking about what's in his heart. And, sometimes, there's a lot of anger or hurt in our hearts that is left from after someone has died, maybe because we couldn't resolve our differences. And it's important to have honesty and be truthful about that. Otherwise, you're doing a disservice to the person that you're remembering, which I think is really powerful writing on Neil Gaiman's part. And it's something that I've been constantly thinking as I've been left in the wake of my own father's death, and trying to think about how I should remember him. And the last thing I want to talk about is new beginnings. This story is touching upon that. I think it reconnects to the whole change theme that's sort of been circling this entire series so far. All of the volumes touch upon change in some way. And that's happening in this volume. Daniel is Dream now. There's a new Dream. He might have the same memories, but he's not the same person. And one of the ways he chooses to be different from the previous Dream is by sparing Hippolyta, because one of the first ways we're introduced to Dream in Volume 1 is someone wrongs him and he does the punishing. Like he chooses to cause a waking nightmare for someone. But even though he could do the same for Hippolyta, he chooses to spare her and actually offer his protection instead, showing that Daniel is capable of being different than the previous Dream. While it is noted that Daniel doesn't have to do things the same, Destruction even pops by and says that exact thing. Like, you could leave and let someone else take care of this, or let it take care of itself, just as I have done. But Daniel says no. Like, he's like, I am Dream of the Endless, and I am choosing to be that. And so, while this is a lot about new beginnings, it's also about how maybe Daniel might not be that different after all. That he might make some similar mistakes to Dream down the road, or he might just end up just being similar to Dream in a more superficial way. It's unsure, but there is that aspect that although he's trying to be different, he might be a little bit similar, and it's important to maybe take those new beginnings, take those new opportunities when they become available, but Daniel is not doing that here. And I do think this is all very heavily introspective. It's forcing you to really think about the Dream that we knew from volumes 1 through 9. Who was he? Why did he do what he did? Was what he did good? Was what he did bad? Who is this character? And I like how Gaiman ties this all together to really get you to reflect on Dream and consider who this character was. Because this is ultimately a post-mortem on Dream as a character. And you could like if you want to write like a book about Dream, like a summary of everything about who he is and his philosophy and what he stands for, I think this book, The Wake, is pretty helpful in getting you to consider those prompts. So I really love Neil Gaiman's writing in that regard for getting us to consider all of these aspects about a character that we've very much grown to love over the course of 10 volumes. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Wake by Neil Gaiman, a really solid entry in this series. I definitely recommend it, and I'm going to say I ultimately still recommend this series because although it does have its low points, I think that this is strong enough. There's a lot of strong points in this series to be worth it. Like you might be bored by volume 2 or 3, but the boredom doesn't last for long. There's something for everyone within each volume. So definitely check this out if you can. Otherwise, if you've read this before or you want to comment on my review, do so below. I would love to hear from you and have a discussion about grief and death and all of those things. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this interesting series. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and griefy travels. Farewell.